This is relatively a straightforward concept. Most of us are aware of it. Social cognition has elements that we studied last week in terms of heuristics and schemas, but this is in more in depth, right? And various types are given. But basically, social cognition is the part of social psychology which deals with the cognitive elements and their interaction with the environment that we find ourselves in. So things that we interpret, analyze, remember, and use information. So it's not so much to do with emotion. It's not so much to do with instinct. It's not so much to do with personality. It's more to do with the cognitive framework in the social setup, right? So it includes things like how we think about the social world, how we attempt to understand our place in it, and place of other people, right? And what the larger social structure is. Now, methods that we use in understanding this social construct and our place within it include heuristics, schemas. Within schemas, there are automatic processing and control processing, right? So heuristics, like we studied last time, are simple rules for making complex decisions or drawing inferences in a rapid manner and seamless, effortless manner, right? So this is basically like using a shortcut. That's how people explain a heuristic, saying that these are shortcuts that help us in decision making. Oftentimes they're very useful, but sometimes they are also very problematic. They create a whole lot of issues for us, right? Uh, so they have both good and bad elements to them. Usually it helps us in our day-to-day interaction and how we deal with the world around us. But if used too often in too many different dimensions of our life, then heuristics can become problematic. Right? That much we know from our study from last week. Now, in the base of social psychology, there are 4 types of heuristics, right? Very important. There are actually multiple. There are almost 10 to 12 types. These 4 are the most important ones, right? There is the representative heuristic, the availability heuristic, anchoring heuristic, and status quo heuristic, right? Now, the question is, why do we use these shortcuts, right? We like to think ourselves as rational beings, and we like to think that, we think of everything in a planned way. And most of us have that trait of calling ourselves a very planned and organized sort of person. But even the most organized of us are oftentimes using heuristics to deal with the amount of workload that is there, right? So that's one very important reason why we use heuristics, because there's an enormous amount of information that we have to stifle through, right? And we can't do it in a organized one by one sort of manner. So these shortcuts sort of help us in making decisions quicker. So information overload is one reason, that is demands placed on our cognitive systems are greater than its capacity. So there's too much information, too much of resource usage, and there's not enough that we can give to it, right? And then on top of that, if there's pressure and there's stress and there's workload, all of that, then that increases the amount of overload that we feel, which then leads to an increase in the usage of heuristics, which then can lead to catastrophic decision making, right? Very irrational decision making. So that's one important reason. The other thing is sometimes situations are uncertain, right? We are not very sure what is the right way to behave here. So then we go into our past and we see what was the right way, what did I see on TV, what did somebody else do, and then we use all of that information to make a decision about this particular situation, right? But that might also not necessarily be the right way to go about things. So these are 2 major reasons why heuristics are used, right? Representative heuristic is where you compare with prototypes. So you summary of common attributes possessed by members of a category. So the rule is the more a person resembles or matches a given group, the more likely she or he is to belong to that group. So you saw all of these traits of this person, dressed in a suit, hair is neat, clean shaven, talks effortlessly, gentlemanly, personal habits, and you thought, oh, okay, these are some very professional sort of uh, behaviors which certain careers have, right? So you found those prototypes to match with the prototype that you have in your head about these specific professions, and then you saw, okay, this is the most closely matched it is, and therefore you said it's an entrepreneur or teacher or whatever, a journalist, right? Uh, so can these judgments be wrong? Of course they can be wrong, right? Why? Because they ignore what is known as base rates, which is the frequency of given events or patterns that occur in a total population. So in a total population, right, these attributes that we spoke about can be for almost 60-50% of people, right? So many people can have all of these traits, either individual traits of these things or combination of 2 or 3 of these traits that we discussed. So they can have there are a lot of people who have these sorts of tendencies, right? So whoever engaged in thinking about this person's profession as a certain way, right? That base rate was ignored. That a lot of people can be similar, right? And then we engaged in the shorter because it seemed like the easiest thing to do, right? So this is one of the heuristics that exists. It's very helpful because, say for example, you need to make a decision like that, right? You're in a meeting, you're in an interview, and they ask you some problem question. You go back to your thought process, you engage in the shortcut, and then you come up with an answer which is correct, right? So at that point, fantastic, worked well. But sometimes it doesn't work well, right? And in those times, it can be problematic. So, for example, in the same situation, in the interview thing, they may be trying to test whether you use shortcuts in your thought process or not, right? And then you engage in this thought process, and immediately they'll be like, oh, this person doesn't really think things through, and they engage in the shortcut sort of spaces. So that's a problem, right? Representative heuristic is also helpful when you're, say, you're trekking, for example, right? And you see some ruffling in the woods. Um, Immediately you'll be on high alert, right? That's a good thing because in that sort of situation, it makes sense, right? Um, so again, that becomes important. So depending on the situation, the heuristic usage is slightly different, right? Um, in terms of research, we have realized that Asians are less likely to be governed by representative heuristic compared to North Americans. Second heuristic, that is the availability heuristic. Now, this is where we make decisions based on how quickly some information comes to us or how much of some information comes to us, right? So it's a strategy for making judgments on the basis of how easily specific kind of information can be brought to mind. So, for example, if I told you to think about a snake, right? You would probably not think of the small snake or the water snake or any of those kinds of snakes, right? You might either think of the really big pythons and all of that, or you might think of an average sized snake, which you see in movies, and there is that person who's like, what is that called? The snake charmer, or some, and then the snake is going there and dancing, and you might think of the Nagin dance and whatever else, right? So the fact that I said think of a snake, it could literally be any snake, right? But most people would think of a very specific kind of thing. If I say think of a SUV, right? You might think of a black SUV, right? That's because you're making a decision based on how quickly something comes to your mind and how much of something comes to your mind. So there are two ways in which availability heuristic works, right? The first is the ease rule, meaning that self-relevant, personally familiar, and emotional judgments follow the ease rule. That means how quickly can something come to you, right? So things that are related to yourself, things that you're familiar with, and things that require emotional judgment will follow the ease rule. That is how quickly does something come to you, right? So one of the things that therapists often suffer with is that they might be like inclined to use their personal experiences while dealing with a client, right? That's because of this, because things that are relevant to the self come to the mind quicker, right? And they have to actively push that away, saying that okay, this is not my I can't be having counter transference here, right? So that's the availability heuristic, that when you're trying to make a decision, things that are relevant to you and emotional in nature will come quickly, but they may not be the right decision to make, right? But you think they're the right decision to make because they came to you instinctively, is how we'll claim it, right? The second is the amount rule. This is when we have less information about a particular subject, or when the task is inherently difficult, we'll say the amount of information about something that will come to our head, we'll think of that, right? So they can work together, they can work in separate ways also. So maybe if I truly think of the greatest footballer, right? You might naturally think of Cristiano Ronaldo, you might think of some other player, right? Whoever is there more often, whatever you see more often, right? Now, obviously, something like this has a lot of debate, but that's the idea, that the amount of information that you see about something also predisposes you to think of that quickly, and therefore, when you're trying to make a decision, you may make an irrational decision because you think that whatever comes to you faster is the right decision, right? It's the instinctual decision, it's the gut decision. But this is known as the availability heuristic, right? Then you have the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. Here, when you don't know something, right, when you're unsure about what the right number or the right number of items or what the right starting point should be, right? You engage in anchoring and adjustment. So you take a very vague number as your starting point, right? And then you make an adjustment from that. So you anchor yourself at a particular point and then you adjust from that. One of the examples is when most people go shopping, for instance, right? Uh, when the shopkeeper shows them something like, say, a dupatta or something like that, and the shopkeeper says 800 bucks, right? Uh, Somebody who knows what the actual value of the dupatta is, will immediately be, they'll say that, oh, like depending on the quality and all of that, they may say a certain number because they're quite sure about what the actual quality of that particular good is, right? But if you are somebody who's never bought a dupatta in your life, and suppose I went to a shop and I said, oh, give me dupatta, and he gave me like 800 rupees dupatta, and all I knew was that I can bargain, I might go like, oh, give me for 600, he'll say 700, I'll be like, oh, okay, done, right? Because for me, the idea is that the shopkeeper would not be so obnoxious also. They wouldn't put such margins also. So if he says 800, it must be for 500. And if he sells it for say 650, 700, then he's making a profit. I'm making a discount. I'm fine, right? Because I have no idea what quality of cloth, etc. So I'm in an uncertain situation. I have anchored myself at a certain rate on the basis that that guy will not be charging obnoxious amounts of margin, right? Whereas in reality, maybe that cloth is worth 100 rupees and that person has said 800 rupees, knowing that I don't know, right? So I've made a bad decision basically. So this usually takes place in the times of uncertainty. We use something, some value that we sort of tell ourselves the story that that's the right starting point, and we put it there. And if we think that's plausible, we'll be like fine, and then we'll negotiate. We'll adjust that little bit here and there, and that's it. So this is done usually to save mental effort. One of the classic places where you'll see this is in your negotiation for salaries, etc. Right? Especially once you're fresh out of college, you really don't know what your value is, right? Nobody will tell you, and then everyone will tell you freshers get paid so less and this and that. So already there is a biased thinking, right? That okay, freshers get paid less. So when a company offers you, okay, how much package are you expecting? First reaction is to say a very low amount because that has been fed into your head, right? That freshers should get paid more less, right? Or you'll say an obnoxiously high amount where the recruiter will be like, what are you talking about, right? Because there is no certainty about what is the right value. Whereas once you start working for a few years, you sort of know what the value is, right? Anyone who's paying you less than that, you're not going to accept it. And you will not ask too high amount also because you're not going to get it, right? So again, that's where anchoring and adjustment sort of takes place, where you negotiate the salary and you sort of reduce and increase and whatever else, right? So that's another one. And the last kind of heuristic is the status quo heuristics. This is basically the idea that because something has existed for such a long time, it obviously means it has value, right? So believe that status quo is good because it has existed for a length of time, and therefore there must be some use for it. So this is used across the spectrum, very often used heuristic, right? In your, say, for instance, the idea of democracy, right? People say that it has existed for thousands of years, must be of some value. Or say the monarchy in England, right? Existed for so long, obviously it has some value. Say some restaurant in Bangalore that has been there for say 100 years. Say Koshi's, okay, in MG Road. Koshi's is it's not great food, but it has existed for such a long time. So everyone is like, obviously, it's existed for such a long time. It has value, right? So a product that has been in the market for a long time may be preferred over a new, better product also because of this. Uh, Now the status quo heuristic can be for a range of stuff. It can be for employees. So saying that, oh, one employee has been in the company for 15 years. Obviously, there is some value that they're bringing, right? I'm using this product for so many years. Obviously, there is some thing it's bringing to me, right? Um, I've been in this relationship for such a long time. Obviously, there is some use to it, right? Even in the face of contrary information. So that's basically the status quo heuristic. It stops us from making good decisions again, right? One of the studies by Elderman, Pattershall, and Crandall in 2010 was about chocolates. They gave the same chocolate, they repackaged it in 4 different forms, and then they told the participants one of the chocolates is 100 years, like produced by a company that was 100 years old, another by 50, another by 25, another is a recent company, right? And they told them to taste and then rate which is the best one. And they found like a lot of people said that the company with the oldest heritage had the best tasting chocolate, and the newest one had the worst tasting chocolate, but it was the same chocolate, right? So this was an interesting study that sort of showed the idea of the status quo heuristic, right? Again, uncertainty is a very central part of this decision, which is the same thing with all heuristics, right? Um, then you have one of the things that creates heuristics is the schemas, right? So schemas is something all of us are familiar with. These are mental frameworks that are created and they categorize information and they organize different types of information in our heads, right? So it's a form of memory only in a way where there is you keep getting more and more information about different things in your life, and all of that information keeps fitting in into the mental categories that you have of different things, right? And they keep adjusting over time with new information that keeps coming in, right? Now the process of creation of a schema is similar to how the memory process works because it's the same thing, right? There is attention, encoding, and retrieval, right? And storage, obviously. So that we are not going to do. We know this. So encoding is consistent. So the difference is that in terms of attention, right? Information that is similar and consistent to the information that you already have will be noticed more than something that is slightly different. Okay, so information that is similar to the information that we already have, you'll pay more attention to it. If it's slightly different, you may not pay as much attention to it, but if it's completely different, again it will grasp your attention. So both extreme forms of information, that is similar information and extremely different information, will grab your attention, but that mediocre average difference will not, right? So that's an important idea about schemas that probably is not taught as often, right? Then you have the idea of encoding, similar again, information that is consistent with the schema is encoded. And even if they're sharply different, which don't agree with the schema that we have, that will also get encoded quicker. Okay. Then in retrieval, it's slightly different where consistent information, the retrieval is better, right? But then there are question marks about asked about retrieval, saying that people just report things that are consistent with the schemas, and we can never really know whether they have been able to retrieve that information or not, right? Um, and when they are corrected for this response tendency, when they are told that you don't only have to tell me things that are consistent with what you're thinking, you can also tell me things that don't agree with you, right? That time we notice that both inconsistent and consistent information are equally likely to be retrieved, right? So in terms of schema is a mental framework, categorization of information, and it organizes information of different elements in our minds. That information is that consolidation of that schema takes place by three processes: attention, encoding, retrieval. Attention is what we pay attention to, what we focus on, right? That if it's consistent with the pre-existing schema of the new information that's coming in, if it's consistent with the pre-existing schema, it might be paid attention to more, or if it's starkly different, right? In both extreme cases, you'll remember it, you pay more attention to it. Same thing for encoding. If it's similar to existing schema, you'll encode it, or if it's really different, you'll encode it. And for retrieval, same thing, right? Both inconsistent and consistent information is there. Okay. Priming is the idea that when a certain situation or stimuli takes place, right, and then that event is triggered in your memory, then it triggers certain thought processes and certain behaviors in the person. So they're predisposed to behaving in a certain way, right? So a situation that occurs when a stimuli or event increases the availability of memory or consciousness of a specific type of information that is there in the memory. So basically something has happened in your environment and it has triggered a older memory, which then predisposes this person to think and behave in the same way that they did when that memory was going on, right? Or when they see something and they sort of get triggered to behave in that way. So one of the examples is, say you watched a movie, okay? Any recent movie, I'm not sure. Say you watched Avengers, right? Best example. And then you saw Iron Man die, right? He snapped his finger. Spoiler alert. But anyway, snapped his finger and it died, right? And then all that funeral scene and all happened. And then when you got out of the theater, right, everyone was very emotional. If you're invested in the entire Marvel franchise and all that, right, you got very emotional. You're like, oh my god, self-sacrificed and blah 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 blah, right? And you're in that state, you're in that triggered emotional state of that something needs to be done, and such a great thing that get did and blah 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 blah. And then suddenly you see someone drop their bag or something, right? You will be more likely to help them out in that situation when you're triggered with that entire thought process of helping and empathy and caring and taking care of other people and self-sacrifice and that sort of thing. You're more likely to help that person in that situation than say when you were just walking on the road, somebody dropped their purse and you're like, they'll pick it up and you'll go. right? This is what priming is. Priming is where you get triggered basically to behave in certain ways uh, based on some emotional cue or some past information, right? Unpriming is the effects of the schema tend to persist until they are somehow expressed in thought or behavior, and only then do their effects decrease. So sometimes what happens is you get primed and you're not able to sort of behave in that primed manner, right? So you get primed very emotionally, and your priming is to help someone else, but there is nobody in your surrounding who requires help. Maybe you're at home alone, you watched Avengers, and then you got really senti, and then you're there for the whole day, and there is nobody whom you can show this caring behavior towards, right? You're just by yourself. So that prime state is there and it's just bugging you and you're not realizing what's going on, right? And you're just in that prime state. Unpriming is where this effect sort of gets released when you're finally allowed to behave in the way that you have been primed, either by behaving or you create a situation in your head and you imagine that, oh, something like this has happened and I'm helping somebody else and blah, blah, blah. Then you get unprimed. So unpriming, and then you come to your normal state of being, right? So that's very important. Priming is where you get triggered to behave a certain way. And then for a length of time, if you can't behave that way, then you are like in this space where you want to, when you want to like release that energy basically. And then you find a way to release that energy. It's called unpriming, right? So you get primed and then you get unprimed when you behave in the way that your priming has occurred. Um, then you have perseverance effect. Perseverance effect is basically what leads to a lot of biases and stereotypes, which is the tendency of schemas to remain unchanged even in the face of contradictory information, right? So you may have a certain thought process about a certain concept in the world, and then you still have your, like, say homophobia. This is a classic example, right? People come with this notion saying that, oh, how can this people, like, same sex people be together and blah blah blah, right? And then they notice that, like, their friends are probably homosexuals, and then they see that the world has accepted homosexuality, legally it's been accepted and all of those things. They will still not change their perspective because they think that they are in the right space, right? They are thinking in the most logical way. So this is known as the perseverance effect. This eventually leads to a whole lot of biases. Um, then the effects of schemas are seen throughout, right? Especially perseverance effects. Yeah, there was one study by Rosenthal and Jacobson where even after teachers were told that IQ has nothing to do with academic performance, they still continued to think that IQ and academic performance were related. And even in terms of marking, they were marking students whom they thought had higher IQ in a much more higher way, right? So schemas are very powerful in that sense. Um, Last part, then you have automatic processing and controlled processing, right? Automatic processing is again when you have extensive practice with a particular type of behavior or information, right? You reach a point where you can effortlessly behave that way, right? It's not very conscious. So for example, right now I'm watching this TV show on Netflix called Drive to Survive, right? For Formula One. So in that, most of those drivers, right, when they are in the race or when they're on the tracks and they're going at like 340 kilometers per hour, uh, for them, they'll always say that I'm not conscious of what I'm doing. It's very effortless for me, right? So they're processing all of that information and all of that speed and all that turning and acceleration and brake and gear and talking to the radio people and all of that in a very automatic way because they've been doing it for such a long time, right? So it becomes almost second nature to them, right? There are lots of scenarios in which this automatic processing will take place for us. You might have this in your workspace, you might have this in your family situation, you might have this in a lot of different areas. If you keep practicing something, it's natural that it becomes an automatic process, right? Controlled processing is a more difficult thing to do, right? This is when a task or type of information requires systematic, logical, and highly effortful manner of processing.